From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Today, theater begins when directors are activists. But first, a membership highlight. We are taking a short break from Script Club and Member Open Play during the summer to carefully review all of the scripts we've received. We plan to resume these free feedback programs in August and September, so stay tuned for further details. And now, on to the show. Pirronne Yousefzadeh is a director, writer, and educator, and the Associate Artistic Director at Playwright Center. Prior to this appointment, she served as Producing Artistic Director at Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center and as the Associate Artistic Director and Director of Engagement at Jiva Theater Center. Over the last 20 years, Pirronne has built a freelance career centering and uplifting the stories of global majority communities with work that embraces high theatricality and joy. Her recent directing credits include The Most Spectacularly Lamentable Trial of Ms. Martha Washington by James Imes at Mixed Blood, the world premiere of The Ants by Ramiz Monsef at Geffen Playhouse, the world premiere of It's Christmas Carol by Mark Bedard, Brent Hinckley, and John Tufts at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, the world premiere of Heartland by Gabriel Jason Dean at 59E59, Viet Gone by Queen Nguyen at Jiva Theater, the world premiere of Kid Prince and Pablo by Brian Quijada at the Kennedy Center, and The Wolves by Sarah DeLapp at Actors Theater of Louisville. Pirronne is a usual suspect at New York Theater Workshop, New Georgia's affiliated artist, member of Ensemble Studio Theater, and an alumna of the 2050 Fellowship at New York Theater Workshop, Segal Fellowship at Williamstown Theater Festival, SDC Denham Fellowship, Lincoln Center Directors Lab, Soho Rep Writer Director Lab, and Drama League Directors Project. In 2020, she was a finalist for SDCF's Zelda Fitchandler Award. She is a proud member of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society. Welcome, Pirronne, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We always start off with this question: how did you get into theater?
I was not supposed to do theater at all. I really just started doing it after school, in like middle and high school, largely because I lived really far away from my school and I needed stuff to occupy my time in the afternoon between when school ended and when my dad would pick me up. And all my friends were doing theater. And so I thought, well, this will be a way to hang out with my friends. And so I just kind of fell in love with it. And my plan was to be pre-med and do theater for fun. And I went to Washington University in St. Louis, which is more known for its pre-med program than its theater department, and also happened to have a really great, small, and high touch, I would say, theater program with really amazing faculty. And so as I found myself more and more interested in my acting classes than my chemistry classes, I gently let my parents know that I was not going to be pre-med anymore, which I think my father is still coping with, and decided to be a theater and English double major. And it was really, just kind of paying attention to what was lighting a spark in me, what I was excited about doing, the classes I wanted to go to, the way I wanted to spend my time. And then also finding directing via acting, which came about halfway through undergrad and came about because there was a summer program at the Globe Theatre in London where I was part of a 4-week acting and directing intensive. All of the students were actors first. And for me, that program was the first time I directed. And it was a scene from King Lear. And I just felt like something, again, sort of lit up and made sense. And it became clear that the things that I sort of struggled with as an actor, namely staying immersed and absorbed fully in a role and not keeping an eye on the bigger picture, were in fact the attributes a director needs. And so what felt like a design flaw became a design feature, and something sort of clicked in a way that then after that, I continued to act for a while, and I do very occasionally nowadays. But as far as directing goes, I never sort of went back from that moment.
When did you realize you wanted to continue in theater as a profession? Was it then, or did you have a moment that sort of defined that for you?
Yeah, I think it really happened sort of in that first year of undergrad where I just, really pivoted from thinking about theater as a hobby to starting to contemplate what it would look like to pursue it professionally. And of course, I didn't really know what I was doing or really know what I was talking about. And I think I had a lot of young arrogance, which was perhaps helpful in some ways, not to fully absorb the enormity and the challenge of taking this on as a profession and pursuing this to be one's career and source of income and all of the things that we all know are really hard. I think I was just like in my, early 20s being like, I'm going to do it. People say it's hard, but whatever. They don't know me. And like, it's hard. It is hard. And, and also I'm glad that I was a little bit of a arrogant little shit because I think that if you fully knew what you're about to embark upon, you might not do it. Like, I feel like if
Indeed.
I fully knew how hard it was, I might not have done it. And I also, was conditioned by two parents who, very much like prioritize like stability and financial security. And like no one in my family is an artist. None of my extended family, is an artist. And so it's a lot of like doctors and like business folk who know a certain kind of like stability in their lives that makes me a weirdo in the family for sure. But yeah, I think it was just kind of recognizing like, oh, these things that I kept trying to push aside in my mind as hobbies are actually the thing I want to be doing. And the thing I was told I should do, or the thing I told myself I wanted to do, that wasn't it. I actually feel like medicine and human biology have ironically become my hobbies. Like it's fun to learn about, like I like learning about like diseases and stuff. And like, and I read about things like that more for fun, whereas I was supposed to do theater for fun and like become a surgeon. So sorry, Dad. But yeah, that's kind of how that cookie crumbled, both all at once and gradually, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I love that medicine, the idea of medicine as a hobby or like human biology. That's amazing.
Pirronne just does like brain surgeries on the side randomly, test stuff out.
I mean, no, it mostly just shows up in reading books like about neuroscience that are meant for like non-neuroscientists, that are meant for like normies like me. And, and I watch a lot of Grey's Anatomy. So, that's kind of how it shows up.
I actually know a lot of people in the theater who started out in medical school or pre-med and then switched to theater, or have gone from theater into medicine. So there must be something in the brain where those things kind of are alike or something.
There is a playwright, a really amazing playwright named Sylvia Corey, who also went to med school, like, and was having like plays go up in New York while she was in med school. And I was like, oh my God, please don't let any of the rest of our like Middle Eastern parents find out about Sylvia Corey, because they're all going to be like, see, you could have done both. And like, I don't know how she did it, but like, I live every day in fear that my parents are going to hear about Sylvia Corey. She is amazing. And her writing is beautiful. And the sheer fact that she did both like astonishes me to no end. And I'll never fully understand it, truly.
That's amazing. Don't let your parents hear this podcast.
No, they won't. They're Luddites, so we're safe.
So today we're here to talk about directors as advocates. You are obviously a brilliant director, so we're kind of happy we didn't lose you to the medical field.
Thanks, Alayna.
But you're also an advocate. And so what does that actually mean to be an activist in a theatrical and artistic space?
Yeah, so I think it took me a long time to recognize that as a director, I have probably more power than, with the exception of the playwright, like anyone else who is contracted to work on a production. In the sense that, primarily one of the first things I do is put a team together. And in doing that, I think that we have a lot of opportunity and responsibility in thinking about how that team is put together. That can be an act of activism in many ways, whether that's ensuring that there is inclusion and equity on the creative team, or making sure that the theater is budgeting for an intimacy director, if that's something that's called for in the play, or if the play does not specifically dictate parameters around race or gender identity in the casting, being the person who advocates for and creates a room that reflects the world that we live in and disrupts some of the sort of white supremacist dynamics that exist in casting, and especially as it intersects with power dynamics between characters, can create a lot of harm potentially for global majority audiences and artists, and for other sort of systemically oppressed and excluded audiences and artists. So I think that there's just like a lot of activism in all of that, and a lot of power. I think a lot of times directors are afraid to use that power, especially early on, because no one wants to be perceived as being difficult. And especially for women, that's like a more frequently assigned label. And but I think that like it, ideally, I think we do it obviously with like love and generosity and tact and all of those things. And like if someone has a problem with that, then they're actually just revealing that they don't share your values, and like maybe that's a good thing to know, as opposed to working in places where you have to compromise what you believe in, and as well as your own personhood potentially. Anyway, that's a separate issue. We can talk about that more. But I think, and the other piece of it, I think, is that like often we're asked as directors to pitch plays, and you know, I sort of skip to the how the play gets made, but also the what is a big component of where that activism can show up. And there are plays with like really harmful messaging around certain communities, and there are narratives out there that are dangerous, that perpetuate like things about Middle Easterners that like I personally don't need anyone to perpetuate, because people can just watch Fox News and they can get that content already. And so, you know, I think also in terms of like not just the how you make the room and how you go about telling the story, but like the stories themselves that as a director, you're pitching, you're advocating for. Like there's opportunity in activism in that as well. And in also like I've had moments where, you know, a theater has come to me being like, we want to do this play. And I'm like, I think that play is harmful and problematic, with all the love in the world towards like the artists who worked hard to make it. And like, let me tell you about why, and also what some other plays are that, you know, may actually be authored by the community the play seeks to represent, and that can, you know, offer perhaps a more nuanced, complex, compassionate narrative about and for people who have been sort of left on the outside of the theater. So yeah, I think there's activism in all of that. And to me, that's like how I do what I feel is my best work, and also how I feel like my work can actually like make a difference beyond trying to just direct a good show, whatever good means, you know, a skilled, competent show. It's like, cool, that's good. But, you know, but for me, the why of it starts with this sort of activism piece.
It's such a lot of really important work that you're talking about that's happening before you even get into the art of directing the play. Can you talk a little bit about who are you talking about when you say the theater? Just for folks who are directors or thinking about directing or wanting to do this important work in their own careers, who are they talking to? How do they advocate for people? And like, who are the gatekeepers in these situations that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, typically, this is such a good question, and thank you for asking me to be more explicit about something that I think I can take for granted as being known. I mean, it depends on the organization and the size of it and sort of how duties are divided. More often than not, these are conversations I'm having with the artistic director. It may also include the associate artistic director or a team of associate artistic directors, or, for instance, like when I was directing a show at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, there was one associate artistic director whose purview was all sort of season programming. And so, it all depends a little bit on the kind of exact staffing structure, but it's usually someone in with artistic and director somewhere in their title. And then, that may also be a literary manager, or a director of new work. Like those are all sort of potential positions that as a freelance director, you may be interfacing with to some extent or to a great extent, around like both pitching plays as well as like then getting to that point of, okay, we're doing the play, it's happening at this time, and now we're going to start putting together the building blocks of the team and the process, and these are conversations that are sort of happening in an ongoing fashion many times before anyone else has been hired.
Are you always invited to be a part of those like casting decisions or things like that? Or are there ways that you as a director could ask to be involved because you care about these important things you were just naming?
I mean, I think that like it is standard practice, and it should be, for a director to be a part of those conversations from the start. Sometimes, there have been times where like I've taken over for a production after someone else was no longer available to do it. And so like the creative team had already been put together, and there was a time that happened, and I was like, wow, that is a very homogenous creative team. And I guess I'm going to just have to think about how my values of inclusion and equity can show up in other ways in this production, because I wasn't able to enact those values in the putting together of that team. I wasn't part of that process. There are also times where theater has already predetermined, that like a resident company member needs to be in the cast. One of their resident designers has to design that show, and part of that is about sort of fulfilling their promise to that designer in like what their job description is and what their artistic opportunities are as a staff member of the theater. But also, it is a like, because those things are often sort of incorporated into the salary, it's also the part of why the play is budgeted the way it's budgeted. And so like typically there isn't really an ability to change much of those things, and typically producing theaters try to let me know most of the time, like ahead of like contracting. Sometimes like they've buried the lead and then that information has come later, which I don't love, just in the interest of transparency. But, beyond those kind of special cases, and I will say I'm also getting better at just asking those questions up front and saying like, hey, is there anything I need to know about like how this team is being put together or how this cast is being put together? Is there anyone you've already like sort of promised a position to or a role to, just so that I know. Also, I like to ask to have a conversation with that designer, even if like they've already been confirmed, to be like, let's just start to build a relationship now. And there have been times where that's actually been great, and I've really enjoyed those collaborations, even if they were sort of forced marriages. Yeah, other than that, I would say, I fully expect to be part of the entire kind of hiring and casting process. And I think it really sets directors up poorly not to be, because they're the ones who have to most directly work with every person on the team. And it doesn't matter to me, and I've been on the artistic director side and the freelance director side, if the artistic director really likes a designer and the director doesn't click with them, like it doesn't really matter how much I like them if I'm not the director. Because I'm not the person who has to work with them to create a world. So I think the best practice is to like find a kind of approach that, both incorporates the values of the organization and their priorities, and also the values of the director and their collaborators who, for me, very often those are designers who like did shows with me way back in New York for like $500, and we built our collaborative language that way. And I also want to make sure that like in the spirit of a rising tide lifts all boats, that when I get an opportunity where they get to work with some resources and be decently compensated for their time and talent, that I'm bringing them along.
That's great. Thank you.
There's another good point of just like being an activist, and whose name do you put in a room of opportunity is like the biggest thing. And so much stuff happens in the background that people don't get to see, because a lot of times you're like, oh, that person's an activist. I've seen them say a speech somewhere, and there's just way more work that happens in the background that people don't see. And just to kind of give some clarity for people, again, that don't necessarily know a director's role in spaces, is kind of talking about the difference between a director that is guiding art to be on the stage and presented for people versus a director who is in a workshop space.
Yeah, two very different spaces. The biggest sort of delineation that I would draw, and of course this can depend a little bit on the nature of the workshop, but with a play that is ultimately going to be produced and put in front of an audience that is, like, more often than not a ticket buying audience, although shout out Mixed Blood, who's whose tickets are free, there is this sense of like culmination and deadline, and like, we're making a thing, people are going to come see it. We want to, obviously tell this story with as much like rigor and specificity and virtuosity as possible. And also, as a director, I'm watching for, especially in previews, like what's clear, what's not clear, where is the audience getting a little shifty in their feet, where are they leaning in, how do I sort of keep learning from that, and kind of looking at audience response and feedback as like another tool towards making the play or musical like the fullest and most like realized version of itself that it can be. Whereas being in workshop, the sense of like destination sometimes can be a lot less capitalist in a great way, I guess I would say. Like, there is less of that sense of like people are coming and they're spending money and the theater's worried about ticket sales or whatever, and sometimes there is no public component. Sometimes like it's just, 5 days or whatever, however many days of rehearsal and exploration and conversation with the writer and the actors, maybe a designer in a kind of like design dramaturg capacity as we do at the Playwrights Center. Maybe there's a sharing on the final day, but it's free. Sometimes it's a really small group that's in attendance, or there's no pressure of a public presentation of any kind whatsoever. I've had workshops like that as well. And so it's, in those cases, I think it's like a lot more internal, and the values, like the priorities are, sort of all around like creating the culture of the room, which is of course, a huge part of any production as well. And supporting the writer and the creative, all of the creative artists in the room as we're finding our way towards what this play or musical or play with music wants to be. And so I would say like the goals are a lot more bespoke and there can be, I find, much more like breath in that. Whereas I feel like in a production process, part of my job is to like disrupt the sense of urgency and find breath and space inside of something that is unfortunately designed without a lot of breath and space currently, because of the nature of arts funding in America and the nature of like where theaters are at financially in this continued moment of post-pandemic recovery. So I would say those are some pretty major differences. And then, like, just to be more sort of practical about it, in workshop, I love getting up on our feet in workshop. It doesn't happen as much. It often ends up sort of remaining around the table or music stands. But, sometimes there can be some physical exploration depending on the contract, because there are some actors' equity limitations around how much people can move in a workshop, depending on what agreement you're on. And so, the work can often remain more text-based, though one of my big sort of queries for the American theater is like, how can we build more support for and like contractual recognition of work that is physically based and not text-based. That's another topic. But, you know, the process, of course, for production, it involves far more pre-production in terms of creating a design. And, you know, then there is that sort of much more articulated staging process that, you know, obviously culminates in something much more physical and three-dimensional in terms of like the realization of design and of the play world than in a workshop where maybe someone will do some sketching, maybe someone will draft some initial ideas of sound cues, but most of the work is about the actors and the text.
You talked about this a little bit, well, kind of a lot at the beginning about, you know, different ways that you're acting as an advocate in the beginning of the process before you get into rehearsals and performance even. Can you talk about how your activism shows up in the rehearsal space and even in the play and for audiences?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the big sort of practices that I instituted in my rehearsal room, which I can't remember who introduced it to me. It was during the pandemic, but it's to do an access check-in at the beginning of every rehearsal, which is just an opportunity for folks to articulate any needs that they have and anything we can do to support their best work. I always have something to share at the access check-in. You know, I'm a single mom by choice, and so everyone needs to know that, like, if I get a call from the babysitter or daycare, whatever we're doing, I need to stop and I need to take that call. And, you know, it can also be an opportunity for people to voice anything they need around like a disability, around, you know, their process in learning lines or needing more frequent bathroom breaks. Like, all of these are things that I think if we don't talk about them, it just makes people either suffer silently or feel really self-conscious if they're attending to those needs without having had the chance to express them. And I think it's part of making the space inclusive and accessible, and remembering that, you know, on a human and humane level, we all have something we are carrying at all times, or things, plural.
I love that practical advice.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I can't take credit for it, but, you know, whoever told me that, thank you, because it's been pretty game changing. And I think that there are also other ways in which like the making of the play can and must like incorporate a sense of thought and care around these values. And like, just as an example of this, and this was, you know, a huge challenge for me as a play, and in the greatest sense, I recently directed the most spectacularly lamentable trial of Ms. Martha Washington by James Iams at Mixed Blood. Shout out Mixed Blood. Shout out James. Shout out free tickets all the time.
And shout out that production. You did an incredible job with it. It was amazing. It was stunning.
Thank you. I appreciate that, you know, and I mean, but I went into that process like very aware of and in constant sort of questioning of the fact that I, as an Iranian American director, was directing a play written by a Black playwright that I think is in many ways a centering of Black joy and a sort of reclaiming of a narrative from the sort of reams and reams of like trauma porn around slavery to a play that gave the enslaved characters a sense of joy and agency. And, you know, one particular example of sort of how that showed up in process for me was in all of the sort of choreography of the play. You know, it felt both, A, I'm not a very good dancer, B, I don't have dance training, C, I found it immoral to consider my role as a director to like impose movement on Black bodies. And in a country where Black bodies are constantly policed, I wanted to approach that differently. Not to say directing is policing, but I wanted to approach it in a way where the actor's creativity kind of led the conversation. And so they generated movements, and then we shaped them and sequenced them together, which felt like it was the best utilization of their impulses and talents, and also my impulses and talents, which are more around curating movement than generating movement. And I just felt like, if not that, like no one needed me to show them how to do the bankhead bounce. And there actually might have been something kind of harmful in that. And so I think that there is like, it remains an active question for me around like, do you have to be of the identity of the community represented on stage to direct the play? That remains an active question for me, although I will say that like the overall trend that I continue to see in the American theater, where white people direct plays by global majority playwrights and are often the ones sort of shepherding those world premieres, I think that is a systemic dynamic for us to examine the why of. That being said, like if I am to work on material outside of my own lived experience, which I hope I continue to do, because I think all of our artistries are bigger than our own individual lived experiences, then it is, the requirement then is for me to show up with that level of mindfulness and care around how am I going to direct this moment? How am I going to create this dance? And how can I do that in a way that also might, and this is another piece of the activism piece, like that the how is as important as the what. I think that's a big component of this for me, in terms of how activism shows up for me in the rehearsal room. That like, if we're going to fight the kind of capitalist mentality of like the show must go on, or the most important thing is how good the show is, like I believe you can make even greater work when people feel like they're treated great, and when people feel empowered and powerful in the room. And I think that like the other responsibility or opportunity a director has is, especially in working with anyone who comes from a systemically oppressed community, like your rehearsal room as a director, you can heal something in that person. You could potentially create an experience for them that tells them it doesn't always have to be like that. It can be great. It can be better. Because what I often hear from actors and other artists is, I guess it's just always going to be kind of shitty. And like, I guess I just can't expect that, I'll be in a process where I won't be harmed. And I'm sure I have created harm. I'm sure, I know for a fact that I have, and I'm not in any way saying like the goal here is perfectionism, but I think that the goal is mindfulness, and then like continued feedback and calling in and reflection, and then finding a way to act on all of that learning to do it a little better the next time, and then like learn from those mistakes and then do it a little bit better.
I appreciate that focus on being able to continue to grow and evolve as we are all trying to be better and learning more about what is harmful and what is not, and all of those practices. It's really encouraging to think about it.
I'm going to kind of remix this next question for you.
No, I like your
sorry
remix.
about that. Because you've been talking about so many things that you are holding space for in the room that are just so background. I just keep going back to how background it is, and how your work is not seen, but it's felt, if that makes sense. And thinking about how you're holding space to not perpetuate stereotypes. You're holding space to make sure that you're advocating for accessibility in the room, and accessibility of everyone in this space. Talking about how people feel empowered, how you're addressing power dynamics. That's just a few things that you've said. And holding all that space, I'm thinking about, one, what are the values that you're holding yourself accountable to? How do you know, like, to check yourself of making sure, hey, am I standing up to the values that I set in place? Do I feel like I'm falling short? If so, how can I correct it? Who do I go to? Is this an education moment for me where I need to go out and look at other resources? Yeah. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that like it's Oh yeah, it's so complicated, I think, as a director, because like everything that I may do to flatten the hierarchy, like the hierarchy's still there, and there's no way, I think, to flatten it entirely. And also I think that can create a different set of problems where people are like, so who's making the decision around here? And ultimately I'd like to know what my blocking is and whether or not I'm, getting in the trap or whatever. I think also, like, as much as empowerment is important, actors appreciate structure and and clear guidance. So, as far as like, how do I check myself? That's always a question. I would say that as a global majority human, I can pretty directly empathize with some dynamics that transcend specific identity, like someone being asked to explain their culture, and the response, like I always have, is like, Google it, right? So like anything that I might feel the impulse to ask, I want to then remind myself to Google, and that like the act of empowering the artists around me does not in any way negate. In fact, it probably increases the need for my own rigorous preparation, so that I'm not asking anybody to do my homework for me, but I'm actually asking them to meet me with their homework and lived experience, and then meet me with my homework and lived experience, and also my recognition of where and how my lived experience does not pertain to the play, is different from the play, is far away from the play. There have been times where I've messed up and no one has said anything, and I felt it in my own body, and I went to the actor and I said, I think I messed up just now, and I want to apologize to you. And there have been times where they've been like, oh gosh, I didn't notice that at all. What are you talking about? And there have been times where they've been like, yeah, you messed up. Thanks for saying something. And even when it is the former, I still feel like that accountability is important, because otherwise it's just kind of like, you're like, I don't want to rely on the fact that an actor didn't notice something or just weren't like pinged by it to be like, I don't need to change anything about my behavior, I'm great, yeah. So I would say like that is around that's about like a constant sort of self-reflection, as well as like having the awareness once again of the positional power and the hierarchy in the room to like invite artists to conversation, because they may not come to me, even if I have like rightfully pissed them off. They might not come to me because there is this kind of like baked in thing of like, you don't want to be difficult and you don't want to be seen as high maintenance, and directors get to hire you, and if you want to keep working, you should keep your relationships really strong, and like all of this stuff that we hear, particularly as we're starting out, that gets ingrained in us, that then can, I think, get in the way of having like generous, loving, compassionate, and fruitful conversations about like harm and harm repair, and then actually bettering those collaborative relationships because of those conversations. Sometimes the harm is irrevocable, or two people just don't get along and they just like don't want to work together again, and that's fine. I am an optimist, and I always look at these moments of like any sort of tension or any sort of potential disagreement as opportunities to strengthen our communication and deepen the relationship. And that's my approach and hope. And so I guess that's what I'm always holding myself accountable to. And then if someone does or doesn't want to meet me there, then that's their choice. But all I can control is how I show up. And there have been moments too where like I've been really sleep deprived and I got kind of short with somebody, or like the meeting went really long and I knew my daughter was going to be up at 5 a.m. and I needed that meeting to be over. And then I, had to come back the next day and be like, hey, sorry, your note was really good. I just was really tired and the clock was ticking down as far as like how many hours of sleep I was going to get. So my bad, because all of the things around processes being compressed and crunched, like those remain the same as they did before the pandemic. And in some cases it's gotten worse. So the systems are all kind of in I would say maybe not all, but in most producing theaters, like the systems and structures still function in such a way that breath is hard to carve out, and taking your time is something you really have to kind of fight to do, because there's nothing about the structure right now that's saying slow down. It's saying like speed up and do it in less time, actually, in many cases. Sorry, that was a lot in a lot of different sort of areas and a long winding road there. But yeah.
I mean, that was a big question that you weren't prepped for.
Yeah, we didn't give you that one ahead of time.
Did my best.
I'm just really moved by what you're talking about in terms of, sometimes I think we think about advocacy as something that we do outside of ourselves for other people or about other people. And I love this self-reflection that you're talking about, the inner work, how important that piece of it is as well. Can you come up with any examples of ways that advocacy for yourself and others has shown up in big or small ways?
Yeah, I definitely can. I mean, one of the huge things that shifted for me is, in light of having a tiny human, it has been my contract negotiation, because childcare is always a consideration for anything that I do, whether it's a workshop or a production. If it's out of town, then that means that my daughter is not going to daycare and needs a babysitter. And I am still continuing to pay for daycare in order to hold her spot, because daycare is extremely, like, every daycare is packed to the gills and there's waiting lists out the wazoo. And once you lose a spot, it's really hard to get one again. And then if it's in town and she's able to go to daycare, yay, there's still going to be additional childcare expenses, though, because of nighttime tech and dress rehearsals and previews and opening and all of those things. And so, one of the things that has come up for me a lot has been bringing this to a theater as an access need. This is an access need. My tiny human needs care. And so, if it's an out of town gig, and I think it's so important for directors who are caregivers of tiny humans to ask these questions, to know, like, what is the housing situation? What is the childcare situation? Is there an ability on the theater's part to procure some items? Because traveling with a kid is a huge schlep, even if you don't have to bring a bathtub and a crib and a stroller. Like, there's just, like, they just come with a lot of stuff. And so, it does make things a lot easier if I know that in the housing there's going to be a pack and play and a high chair and whatever else. And it's actually something that led to some conversations here internally at the Playwright Center. And we now have some of those items ready the next time we have an artist who needs a baby bathtub and a pack and play and those things. And I just think that our society, our culture is not kind to working parents, and it sure does put working mothers especially in this, like, constant catch-22 of you're either a shitty mom or like a shitty participant in our capitalist system. Like, you're failing at one thing at all times. And so, I think it's really important for theaters to say, like, when we hire you, we are hiring you, the artist and parent and human, and we are not going to ask you to silently bear the extra costs and sacrifices that requires. There have been times where I've had to push back really hard, and it's difficult, of course, because, again, I don't want to be seen as difficult, but I also know that, like, I'm potentially greasing the wheels for the next parent artist who wants to work at that theater or who gets an offer and is like, cool, would love to come. I have twins. Like, we're going to need an extra room and whatever else, a pumping space in the theater, like things like this, that isn't a bathroom, ideally, may I add. I know I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but these are, like, just for anyone out there who's, like, contemplating having a child, adopting a child, or who's now sort of segueing back into freelance directing after having had a child. Like, I just think it's really important to ask these questions and to advocate for these things, because, like, the industry already is set up to, like, push parents out, and that disproportionately affects women. And like, these are the ways to rectify that gender inequity, and also like invite the artistry of parents and caregivers. And like, for me, I'll just say, like, I know it has changed me as an artist and changed me as a director. And for me, like, that's an additive. Like, I'm not saying, like, to be a good director, you have to have a kid. For me, it has cracked something open. And so I want to continue to like contribute that as I continue to change also as a parent of an ever-growing tiny human.
That's a great example. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, you've kind of bled into the next question of the challenges that come up with being an activist. If being an activist was easy, everyone would do it. There's some specific challenges that come with that. And part of that has to do with the identity of the activist and the identity of who they are holding space for. And you have mentioned not being, and this is very specific towards women and people of color as well, of not wanting to be the challenging person, because we are in a field where it's not about getting a job, it's about getting a job again. Mm-hmm. And so you always just have that fear. I will be put out of work if I'm too challenging. But it's really sad to say that challenging means asking for needs that you have, help with needs that you have, just to be in the space and feel welcomed in the space. Mm-hmm. So what are some challenges that either you have faced personally, or challenges that any advocate is going to have to come up against and find a way through?
I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that, like, and I've been on a very long journey about this that long precedes even my decision to pursue directing professionally. But, you know, I'll just be really blunt and say, like, there are only certain identities that are allowed to get angry, and like a woman of color is not one of them. And so, you know, and that's some bullshit, but that is the dynamic. And it's very easy to get dismissed if I don't check my anger. And I mean, and I also just like personally believe that, you know, that is not the best part of me, the most capable part of me, you know, the way I want to show up in the world, what I want to model to my daughter. You know, it isn't useful. There are times where, yes, I am angry, and I have to figure out how to like channel that productively and articulate that in a way that isn't about like centering my rage or my righteous indignation or whatever, but like my values, like whatever it is that I'm feeling, it is about ultimately like the values and what's going to set up these artists and this work for success, period, end of story. If it's about my ego, if it's about the fact that this person interrupted me a lot, I need to process that with my therapist. But like blowing up at them about it while I'm trying to actually advocate for something that like I need and the artists need in order to do our best work, that's not going to help anything. And so, you know, while I do struggle a little bit with like going high when they go low all the time, I do think ultimately one's anger or sadness or frustration like have to be sort of repurposed into action and repurposed into an articulation of values in order to advance whatever it is you advance, whether that is making sure that there's an intimacy director or making sure that you're doing a 5-day rehearsal week, or, you know, whatever it is that is the sort of subject of debate in that moment. And I think that the other, you know, part of that is recognizing that like if that puts people off, it probably wasn't a place to continue working at. And that's a hard thing to say, especially in this moment where I know a lot of artists are struggling and there aren't as many opportunities out there because seasons are getting shorter and there's a lot of co-productions happening. So like just the number of jobs is less. And, you know, there have been places that I've worked where I advocated, I did it with tact, I did it with as much grace as I could possibly muster. I actually asked directly what they planned to do to rectify the harm that had been created, and the answer was crickets. And they have not asked me to direct again at this theater that shall remain anonymous. And, am I stung by that? Yes. And would I feel safe going back, and also going back with my child, knowing what I experienced? Is that the environment I want to be in with my child in this one wild and precious life? Not really. And I would need to know that things would change, significantly from what I experienced. So yeah, it stings to not get the call sometimes. And also, one of my friends says man's rejection is God's protection. And I do think that is true. And I think that it's okay to say, I'm not a fit for every theater, and not every theater is a fit for me. If that's about, again, not ego, but about values and about being in a place where you can do your best work.
How do you take care of yourself? Because this, everything you're talking about, it's a lot of emotional, physical, like mental labor and sometimes pain. I wonder how you take care of yourself, and if there are things that you have learned to do in advance to make sure, where we can never make sure, but to try to ensure that you're coming into a space that will do less harm.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have a therapist. I really like my therapist. I know that can be an issue of financial access. And so, I think it's always important to look at those sliding scale opportunities for therapy, and or advocate to one's employer that that should be part of the coverage if the director who's listening right now also happens to have a job with benefits. So again, it's another place for some activism if that is something that's not currently within reach. And or as well as other practices around self-care. I've started doing some journaling. I rely on my community of friends and family and chosen family, really, in moments that are hard. And I also think that it's important to remind myself that, and this is the tough part, but to remind myself that you don't make 100% of the shots you take, you do your best. And when you wanted the big win and you got the small version of it, a win is a win. That everything ripples, that everything, accumulates, that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And that also, for me specifically, as someone who's also a producer and also has had that producing, that artistic director position, has been on the producing side of a producing theater. It's easy for me as a freelance director to be well, obviously the solution is this, or if I were on that side of the table, I would be doing that. And to sometimes even try to do those things from my seat as a freelance director. And I think that part of my self-care is also about remembering what is my job and what is not my job. And I think that as a director, it's very easy for everything to become your job. And so, and I fall victim to this. I take on producerial missteps, and I try to rectify them. And I'm trying to be better about identifying when that's happening, to either be intentional about doing that, or to say, wait a minute, Pirronne, sit down, call the AD or, the line producer or whatever, tell them what's coming up and ask them to get their hands dirty and solve the problem, And so, all of those things I think are around drawing boundaries, creating some practices around mindfulness, and also just releasing, the day or the whatever, the crappy meeting or the weird whatever interaction after the preview, to just find some ways to put it down. And, going back to the medical thing from the beginning, I am not in an operating room, and that's something that I always sort of say kind of jokingly, not because I don't take what I do extremely seriously, but I also think that as rigorous and exacting as I want to be in my work, I need to remember for my own sake that what I do is professional play pretend. And that is wonderful. And it also means that no one is on the operating table and no one is going to die by like what decision I make in staging or choreographing this moment or that. And like, it's easy, I think, for us to get so sort of, it's easy to spiral, you know, and I just sometimes just need that perspective check to be like, you're not doing the thing your dad said you should do. So you get to play, like that's your job. You get to play. And yeah, take it seriously. And obviously that's, you know, important in these moments of potential harm and in advocating for one's values and for inclusion and accessibility. And at the end of the day, you know, after a 12-hour day in the theater, like, remember you got to play today, even if it was hard.
Oh, that's a good one.
That should be on a t-shirt, like for theater kids.
Like what we call an emergency is like, in the grand scheme of emergencies,
that is true.
Not an emergency, you know?
Yeah. I definitely remember like crying during a production because we couldn't find the right color brown couch.
Maybe less couches also. Like maybe we can interrogate the need for couch. What else could it be?
Mm-hmm.
What else could it be?
So this is a new question that has become a big pillar in our conversations of what shout outs or art crushes would you like to share?
Oh my gosh, I have so many. It's crazy. I mean, first of all of our Venturous Fellows, all the writers at the Playwright Center, but like I was just in a workshop of space with L.M. Feldman. I've had a like 15-year art crush on Elle, and we're going into workshop next week for Mother of Exiles by Jessica Huang, which I've been working on with her since since the pandemic, and it'll be our first time working on the play together in person. So I'm just super excited about that. I think Jessica's an amazing, amazing writer. I can't stop thinking about Aya Ogawa's The Nosebleed, which I saw at the Walker and remains and will forever be like one of my favorite experiences I think I've ever had in the theater. And I'm so excited for their piece Meat Suit and where it's going, and just how talk about like, you know, artist parents, like how it's putting something on stage that I think is often invisibilized in our culture around motherhood. Deepika Guha, Forever Has My Heart. Brian Quijada is one of my favorites and just makes work with like such joy, and just emanates such joy in a field that can be really hard. And then you see Brian and you're like, it's okay. It's all going to be okay. Yeah, those are some of the people that I'm like thinking about right now, as well as like, just, I don't know, so many more. There's just so much exciting work happening. There's so many cool plays being written. There's so many like exciting designers kind of breaking open what can happen in a theater. While it's a hard time financially, I mean, I don't want to look at any theater's budget right now. I'm sure it's really sad. Like when I actually see the work that's being created, I'm like, oh, it's maybe never been more amazing than this. Like the work is amazing. And somehow, you know, we just need to figure out the whole government support for the arts thing. But, you know, the work is great and the people making it are great. So they just need to be supported.
Thank you so much for this conversation today. And thank you so much for what you have done and are doing for artists through your own work.
We have to ask the final question.
We do. This is Alayna's favorite question.
Oh, God. Okay.
So today, right now, where does theater begin for you?
Theater begins with the most impossible idea and the question, how are we going to do this? For me, that's where theater begins.
How are we going to do this? I love seeing the answer to that every time I walk into a theater.
What about for you, Hannah?
I really appreciated what you said early on in the conversation, Pirronne, about your move from pre-med to theater. But you said something that really stood out to me. You said you found what was lighting a spark in you. And so I just want to lift that up and say that theater begins when you find the thing that lights the spark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Really resonated with me how you were talking about, like, just who do you want to be in the world? Like, who do you just want to wake up and be, and how you move through the world? And so today, theater begins when you pursue the thing that makes sense and feels right, but you're prepared to advocate for yourself and others when it doesn't.
I like that. I like those a lot.
Yeah. Love it. Well, thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Thanks for having me.
Join us for our next episode on June 26th. Let us know on Spotify where theater begins for you, and feel free to send your questions for future episodes to the link in the bio.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.